Okay, good afternoon everyone, and welcome to this brief reintroduction to the first 6 weeks of MN204, which is designed to help people for the repeat exam in August. So a couple of things I'd like to say. First thing is, just because something has been examined in the previous exam doesn't mean it will or won't be examined in this exam. There might be some overlap, it won't be huge. Some topics that weren't examined from the first part obviously will be. The slight mix-up over the setting of the summer paper meant that there has to be a little bit of change. That's the other thing to remember, is that 2 or 3 topics from this section will be on this exam, and 2 or 3 topics from Sullivan's section will be on the exam. That will happen this time. So anyone who's thinking that the kind of the layout or the structure of the exam will follow the June one, it will follow it on that there will be 5 questions with 2 parts each, so you have to answer 3. But it is really important to note that that 2 or 3 questions will come from this part, and 2 or 3 questions will come from Solomon's part. So the first thing I would actually really recommend that you do is you look at the summer revisions screencast for the first 6 weeks. It's a pretty thorough introduction to the topics on the course. I'm going to go over a couple of things again today, but what I've also done in some detail in that one is I've talked a little bit about question technique, exam structure, and different things, and they're all really important because, you know, people do, when they're under pressure, people don't always do their learning justice. So things like making sure you attempt all the questions, making sure you leave plenty of space between questions are important. You know, you have a certain amount of time to complete the exam. You might as well get everything done in it. So we'll talk about the main topics of the first 6 weeks today that will produce 2 or 3 of the questions that are coming up. Something to maybe also worth mentioning is that there is a possibility that some of the questions might span over more than one topic. So there might be a general theme around, for example, the changing environment, the changing business environment, and an organisation might need to be able to analyse that environment and also discuss strategies that are more appropriate for a changing environment, such as open innovation. So there might be some connection between how they would look at the environment and what they would do to deal with it in the different parts of it. It's really important to examine the question to see how the marks are, to make sure that they aren't evenly distributed, or if they are evenly distributed, and allocate your time as such. A big failing that people make in exams is a 2-part question that says has 12 marks and 8 marks, and someone will spend 80% of their time on the 12-mark question rather than 60% of their time, which means they only spent 20% on the 8-mark when they should have spent 40%. So they really struggle to get the marks on the second part. So, you know, what you're trying to do is to collate, review, and critically appraise. Don't think in terms of chapters. Think in terms of topics and themes. So think about things like, you know, and we'll talk about those themes at the start, but that gives you an overarching idea of how to tackle questions. You know, question technique is important. I have more detailed comments on that in the other screencasts. But what I will say is, you know, label your questions, leave plenty of space between them, use answer plans. Don't answer 2 questions on the one page, just makes it harder for the examiner, and if you need to go back and make a change, you've no space. Use the time you have. The 90 minutes you have, use it well. So each question will have 2 parts, so there'll be some level of description and discussion. So the best answers have high-level critical analysis, where they can, you know, introduce the advantages and disadvantages, the pluses and the minuses, but they also integrate examples into answers. Lots of people, when asked, you know, to discuss using an example, will come in with an example at the start and then not integrate it into the points they make afterwards. You know, if you're discussing something with an example, you need to map that example to all parts of your answer. If your example only is relevant to one part, bring in different examples, but ideally a good example will be rich enough to do it. So obvious example cases, Paddy Power, Ryanair are companies that use information technology really effectively in their businesses. Amazon is another one. Think of Facebook, think of the companies that you deal with on a daily basis so you can actually relate what they do. If you're trying to think of some kind of complex IT provider or something like SAP and you don't really, get what they're doing and you're trying to make sense of an example, you may struggle a little bit with it. So 2 or 3 questions from weeks 1 to 6, 2 or 3 questions from weeks 7 to 12, and that will happen this time. So plan your time, read it, use your answer plan, allocate time to each part in the answer plan. So everything you write gets marked. So even if you draw a line through answer plan or whatever, we will still have a look at it, and if there's something that you haven't included in your answer that is relevant, you will score for it, but only if it's to your advantage. Thing to remember is if you just write complete nonsense, it doesn't actually score marks. So if you're talking about, Porter's 5 forces and you start talking about the invention of the stirrup, changing cavalry having an impact on warfare in Europe and redefining the boundaries of Europe, it's very hard to see how it's relevant to an information technology module. Something to remember is, lecture notes are not published material. This is discussed. People need to read the textbook. They need to make additional readings to have high-level answers. So notes are only part of the lecture. They're a help, and they point you in the right direction. So you need to go back and look at the chapters. Okay, so getting to the content, this course is an introduction to management information systems and information technology. So information systems is really the relation between people, processes, and technology. So we can think of what the themes are around people. There's ethics, there's your personal privacy, there's the problems associated with social media. So if you think things like, harassment, bullying, addiction. And then there's also people issues around job losses. So, is IT actually technology replacing jobs? So think around the processes within an organization. With the functional areas of information systems. So things like the accounting system, the HR, the payroll systems. We also have things like risk, business process improvement, where we improve processes, business process re-engineering, where we radically redesign them. The value chain, how organizations actually make money, enterprise resource planning, supply chain management, and customer relation management are all around the processes. Around the technology side, what we have is hardware, software, networking, cloud, and we cover those in things. And, we cover those in the multiple choice as well, so we don't really need to worry about them so much for this exam. Obviously, when you're talking about examples, it's useful to actually understand the terminology and the jargon that you're actually using in those. But where it gets really interesting in information systems is the interface between the people, processes, and technology. So, building up to that, we have things like Web 2.0, which is a participative web, where it's a democratic web where everybody is able to produce and share content. Other things then around the interface between people, process, and technology, globalization, the change, how technology is actually changing the world. We think, the effect that that's had on organizations and how organizations innovate. The shift to an open innovation paradigm is really important. Security. So security is a socio-technical problem. It relates to people issues as well as technology issues. We've social computing, things like Facebook, artificial intelligence. And another thing then to think around that is, the business environment itself. So things that are very important in that is how technology is actually changing the business environment. So Porter's 5 forces gives us a really powerful way of examining that. So what we often see is that technology has actually radically changed the environment of an entire industry, such as book selling or fashion. The 5 forces allows us to look at that. And then we think of, IT alignment. So it's really important that the information technology that an organization uses is closely aligned with the strategy of the organization. So, again, if we continue our introduction, we have different types of computer-based information systems. We have our functional, varying from functional area information systems, that's a sport-specific thing, all the way up to, electronic commerce systems that support the entire organization, supply chain management systems, that really complex systems. Something to bear in mind again is that every organization is a technology company at this stage. So we've got things like marketing companies that are relying on social media. Genomics, which was previously done in the laboratory, is now using computer simulation. So, we're moving towards autonomous self-drive cars, agriculture relying on technology. Retail, has become, the merger of bricks and clicks retail. And then, another thing that's really important is, is things like CGI in acting. So acting would have been considered maybe a classical discipline where, that wasn't highly dependent on technology, but we're seeing the use of blue screen and whatever. I visited the Harry Potter Museum over the summer, and my children got to go on blue screen on a blue screen background on a broomstick, and when you see the video of it, it actually almost looks realistic. So this is a real challenge for organizations, that technology enables some companies to get bigger and bigger, and the more technology they have, it's harder for small companies to compete. So the smaller companies need to be agile. They need to have strategies that enable them to compete. So just moving quickly through the topics. Business information technology. So this is the idea that there's a tight integration of the IT function with the organization's strategy, missions, and goals. So that's really important for an organization, that if they're spending a lot of money on IT, that it actually is related to what they're trying to achieve. We have this idea of business process management then, where we either take a very radical approach. So if we look at the business process re-engineering, is where you have the big jump, it's radical, and the business process management is where we incrementally improve our processes on a continuous basis. So then if we move to looking at the actual environment itself, one of the really important things to think about is this idea of is Porter's competitive forces model. So the idea is that the competitive environment for an industry or an organization can be described by 5 forces. Let's start at the middle. It's the rivalry between an individual organization and competing organizations. So if we're thinking about supermarkets, what's the rivalry between Dunnes Stores and Aldi and Lidl and Tesco, and that's, it's really high. And we asked that, what is the threat of new entrants into that industry? People would have always said it was low until the German retailers came along. Aldi and Lidl came along and actually were able to break down the barriers to entry into it. The bargaining powers of buyers. So bearing in mind, the buyer for an industry often isn't the end consumer. So if you're a pharmaceutical company, it might be hospitals or insurance companies as opposed to patients. Substitute products. What can people use instead of it? So the obvious substitute for the book is the Kindle. The bargaining power of suppliers. So can your suppliers actually gang up and bargain with you, or are they quite weak? If there's only one supplier of a product, like, for example, De Beers has a practical monopoly on the diamond market, their bargaining power is actually quite high. And that's interesting in itself. But where in the IT module, what we would actually be interested in is, what is the effect of technology on those forces? So does technology increase the threat of new entrants? Does it improve or disimprove the bargaining power of suppliers? Does it increase the threat of substitutes? So obviously for something like music or a product that can be digitally copied, there's a huge threat of substitutes and competitors. Something to remember when applying the 5 forces, and this is really important because I think it's something where people maybe slipped a little bit in the summer exam, is to think, to define what the industry is and who the buyers are and who the suppliers are. If you're thinking from the point of view that you're Dunnes Stores or you're Paddy Power or you're a local bookshop, decide who your suppliers and buyers are. There's a lot of the examples they took it that, you know, the supplier and the buyer varied, that the unit of analysis that they were using to study the problem varied from point to point. So they would actually consider, the customer to be the customer and them to be